The bounty hunter let a saloon girl hide in his wagon. The next day, a bounty was placed on his head. The sound of iron horseshoes against weathered cobblestone echoed through the pre-dawn silence of Tombstone, Arizona territory. A lone figure guided his wagon through the empty streets, the wooden wheels creaking under the weight of his cargo. What he carried beneath the canvas tarp would change everything he thought he knew about justice, loyalty, and the price of doing what's right. Jack Morrison had been hunting men for 12 years. His weathered hands gripped the reins with the confidence of someone who had tracked killers across 3 territories and never once let a bounty slip through his fingers. The morning mist clung to his black duster coat like the ghosts of every outlaw he had brought to justice. His steel-gray eyes scanned the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who understood that in his line of work, hesitation meant death. The wagon rolled past the Silver Dollar Saloon, its doors still swinging slightly from the chaos that had erupted just hours before. Broken glass littered the wooden sidewalk, catching the first rays of sunlight like scattered diamonds. The acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixing with the familiar sense of horse sweat and desert dust that defined frontier life. Behind him, hidden beneath layers of canvas and rope, a young woman named Catherine held her breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she listened to the rhythmic clatter of the wagon wheels, each rotation carrying her further from the nightmare she had witnessed. The emerald dress she wore was torn at the shoulder, and dried blood stained the delicate fabric where she had pressed against the saloon floor, pretending to be dead while real bullets flew overhead. Jack had found her there in the aftermath, crouched behind an overturned poker table with terror written across her face. Most bounty hunters would have walked away. Most would have left her to face whatever consequences awaited. But something in her desperate plea had reached past the hardened exterior he had built over years of chasing desperate men through unforgiving terrain. The town of Deadwood lay 3 days ahead, and Jack knew the journey would test every survival instinct he had developed during his years on the trail. The wagon creaked steadily northward, leaving behind the relative safety of established settlements for the lawless. Expanse of open territory where justice was measured in ammunition and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Catherine had worked at the Silver Dollar for 8 months, serving drinks and enduring the crude advances of miners, gamblers, and drifters who saw saloon girls as property rather than people. She had dreams once, dreams of opening a dress shop in San Francisco or maybe teaching school children in a quiet town where people knew her name without whispering about her past. Those dreams seemed impossibly distant now, buried beneath the weight of what she had seen and the danger that followed in its wake. The previous evening had started like any other. The saloon was thick with cigarette smoke and the raucous laughter of men spending their hard-earned wages on whiskey and poker. Catherine moved between the tables with practiced grace, balancing drinks and deflecting inappropriate comments with the skill of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous waters without making waves. Then Silas Kane had walked through those swinging doors. Kane was a name whispered in fear throughout the territory, a former Confederate soldier turned outlaw who led a gang of killers responsible for bank robberies, train heists, and murders spanning from Texas to Colorado. His pale blue eyes were those of a man who had stared into the abyss so long that it had stared back, leaving him hollow and capable of unimaginable cruelty. What happened next would be burned into Catherine's memory forever. Kane had approached the bar where Thomas McKinnon, a circuit judge known for his harsh sentences against outlaws, was enjoying what would be his final drink. The conversation started quietly, almost cordially, before erupting into violence that left 3 men dead and the saloon floor slick with blood. But Catherine had seen something that Kane believed no one else had witnessed. She had seen him deliberately plant evidence in Judge McKinnon's coat pocket, evidence that would frame the dead man for crimes he never committed. She had watched Kane's cold smile as he orchestrated a scheme that would destroy a good man's reputation even in death. Now, as the wagon rolled through the desert landscape, Catherine understood that her knowledge made her the most dangerous person in the territory. Cain would move heaven and earth to silence her, and anyone who helped her would become a target in his crosshairs. Jack Morrison had built his reputation on being unpredictable. While other bounty hunters operated from established patterns, he deliberately varied his routes, his methods, and his destinations. This approach had kept him alive when lesser men had been gunned down in dusty streets or ambushed on lonely trails. But helping Catherine meant abandoning the careful strategies that had sustained him through 12 years of hunting killers. The landscape gradually shifted from the rocky terrain around Tombstone to the rolling hills and sparse vegetation of the high desert. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels against the brightening sky, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the harsh environment that shaped all life in this unforgiving land. The air was crisp with the promise of another scorching day, and Jack knew they would need to find shelter before the sun reached its merciless peak. Catherine finally found the courage to speak when they were several miles from town, her voice barely audible above the creaking wagon wheels. "Why are you helping me?" Jack continued staring ahead at the trail, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his worn hat. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of years spent making impossible choices. Because sometimes doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe. The simplicity of his response struck Catherine with unexpected force. In her world, men typically helped women because they expected something in return. The concept of selfless action was so foreign that she struggled to accept it at face value. As the morning progressed, Jack shared fragments of his story. He had been a lawman once, a sheriff in a small town called Cedar Springs where he had tried to build something decent in the middle of chaos. But politics and corruption had destroyed his faith in official justice, leaving him to pursue his own version of righteousness through the bounty system. Catherine listened to his measured words and began to understand that beneath his hardened exterior lived a man still fighting for principles that most people had abandoned. His decision to help her was not impulsive kindness, but a calculated stand against the forces that had driven him from legitimate law enforcement into the morally ambiguous world of bounty hunting. The first sign of trouble appeared as a dust cloud on the southern horizon, visible long before the riders creating it could be identified. Jack had been expecting pursuit, but seeing it confirmed sent ice through his veins. He estimated at least 6 horsemen, moving fast and closing the distance with each passing minute. "Get down and stay quiet," he instructed Catherine, his voice calm despite the approaching danger. "Whatever happens, do not come out until I tell you." Cain's men were skilled trackers, and Jack knew that a loaded wagon could never outrun determined riders on horseback. His only advantage lay in choosing the ground where the confrontation would take place. Ahead, the trail wound through a narrow canyon with high walls and limited escape routes. It was dangerous territory for someone being pursued, but it also offered opportunities for a man willing to take calculated risks. The canyon walls rose around them like stone guardians, their red sandstone surfaces, carved by centuries of wind and water into fantastic shapes that resembled sleeping giants and ancient fortresses. The trail narrowed to barely accommodate the wagon, forcing Jack to navigate carefully between rocks that could shatter a wheel or cripple a horse with one move. Here, in this natural bottleneck, Jack made his stand. He positioned the wagon in a defensible spot where the canyon walls provided cover from 3 directions, leaving only the trail approach exposed. His rifle was a Winchester repeater, well-maintained and loaded with ammunition that could drop a man at 300 yards. His Colt revolver hung heavy on his hip, a reliable backup weapon that had saved his life more times than he cared to remember. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, amplified and distorted until it seemed like an army was bearing down on their position. Catherine pressed herself against the wagon floor, fighting the urge to peek out and see what was coming. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth as she listened to Jack's steady breathing above her, the calm rhythm of a man preparing for battle. When Kane's riders appeared at the canyon entrance, they moved with the practiced coordination of men accustomed to violence. They spread out in a loose formation, each man positioned to provide covering fire while advancing on the wagon. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Dutch Garrison, raised his hand to signal a halt just outside rifle range. "Morrison!" Dutch's voice carried easily across the stone walls. "We know you got the girl. Send her out, and maybe we let you ride away from this." Jack's response was measured and clear. "The lady's under my protection. You want her, you'll have to go through me." The standoff stretched for long minutes, neither side willing to make the first move. Jack understood that time was his enemy. The longer this continued, the more likely it became that additional reinforcements would arrive. But he also knew that Kane's men were professional killers who would not hesitate to murder both him and Catherine if given the opportunity. Dutch Garrison was growing impatient. He had explicit orders from Kane to retrieve the girl alive and eliminate anyone who had helped her. The narrow canyon offered limited tactical options, but his men were experienced fighters who had survived encounters with sheriffs, soldiers, and rival gangs. One bounty hunter, even one with Morrison's reputation, should not present an insurmountable obstacle. The battle began with a single rifle shot that echoed like thunder through the canyon. Jack's bullet found its mark, dropping one of Kane's men from his saddle before the others could react. The remaining riders spurred their horses forward, seeking cover behind rocks and canyon walls while returning fire with a fury that sent bullets ricocheting off stone surfaces in deadly patterns. Jack moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. His rifle spoke repeatedly, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. 2 more riders fell before reaching the wagon, their horses rearing and bolting in terror at the smell of blood and gunpowder. But Kane's men were professionals, and they adapted quickly to the situation. Dutch directed his remaining fighters to flank positions where they could bring crossfire to bear on Jack's defensive position. The canyon that had initially provided protection was becoming a trap as bullets began arriving from multiple angles. A rifle round splintered the wagon wheel inches from Catherine's hiding place, sending wooden fragments flying like shrapnel. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she pressed harder against the canvas that concealed her. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space, each shot reverberating off the canyon walls until individual reports blended into a continuous roar of violence. Jack felt the burning sensation of a bullet grazing his left shoulder, but he ignored the pain and continued firing. His ammunition was running low, and he knew that unless something changed dramatically, this canyon would become his grave. But retreat was not an option. Catherine was depending on him, and he had given his word that she would reach safety. The tide of battle turned when Dutch Garrison made a tactical error. Eager to end the fight quickly, he exposed himself while moving to a better firing position. Jack's rifle found him in that moment of vulnerability, the heavy bullets striking center mass and spinning the outlaw leader around before dropping him to the rocky ground. With their leader down, Kane's remaining men lost their coordination and fighting spirit. The canyon that had seemed like a perfect killing ground suddenly felt like a death trap, with no clear escape route and a deadly accurate rifleman controlling the high ground. One by one, they began to retreat, dragging their wounded companions and leaving their horses to scatter across the desert landscape. The silence that followed the gunfight was profound and unsettling. Jack's ears rang from the continuous rifle fire, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the still air. He remained alert for several minutes, scanning the canyon walls and trail approaches for any sign that the attack might resume. Only when he was certain that Kane's men had truly withdrawn did he allow himself to relax slightly. "Catherine," he called softly, "it's over. You can come out now." She emerged from beneath the canvas like someone awakening from a nightmare, her green dress torn and dusty but her spirit unbroken. The relief in her eyes was overwhelming, but Jack could see that she understood this victory was temporary. Cain would not give up easily, and their troubles were far from over. They spent the remainder of the day repairing the damaged wagon wheel and tending to Jack's wounded shoulder. Catherine proved surprisingly resourceful, using strips torn from her petticoat to create bandages and demonstrating knowledge of wound care that suggested experiences she preferred not to discuss. Her gentle touch as she cleaned and dressed his injury reminded Jack of why he had chosen to help her despite the obvious dangers. As evening approached, they continued their journey toward Deadwood with a new urgency. The gunfight had undoubtedly alerted other elements of Cain's organization to their location and direction of travel. Every mile they covered brought them closer to relative safety, but it also drew them deeper into territory where Cain's influence was strongest. The landscape gradually changed as they traveled north, the harsh desert giving way to rolling grasslands dotted with stands of cottonwood and pine. The air became cooler and carried the scent of distant mountains, a welcome relief after the oppressive heat of the Arizona Badlands. But the beauty of the scenery could not mask the growing sense of danger that surrounded their flight. Catherine found herself studying Jack's profile as he guided the wagon through increasingly difficult terrain. His weathered features told the story of a hard life lived according to uncompromising principles. The lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into desert sun while tracking dangerous men across endless miles of hostile territory. His steady hands on the reins demonstrated the calm competence of someone who had faced every challenge the frontier could offer and emerged stronger for the experience. "What will you do when this is over?" she asked as they made camp beside a small stream that evening. Jack considered the question while building their campfire, his movements economical and practiced. "I haven't thought that far ahead. Staying alive tends to occupy most of my attention these days." Catherine understood that his evasive answer revealed more than direct honesty might have. Jack Morrison was a man who lived day by day, contract by contract, never allowing himself to plan for a future that might be cut short by a faster gun or a better tracker. The realization filled her with unexpected sadness for this strong, principled man who had sacrificed so much in service of an unforgiving profession. The night passed quietly, but Jack remained alert throughout the dark hours. His experience had taught him that professional killers often preferred to attack during the vulnerable period between midnight and dawn, when their targets were most likely to be sleeping deeply. He dozed fitfully, one hand always resting on his rifle while his ears strained for any sound that might indicate approaching danger. Dawn brought disturbing news in the form of fresh horse tracks crossing the trail ahead of their position. The tracks were recent, probably made during the night, and they showed signs of at least 8 riders moving at a steady pace toward Deadwood. Jack studied the impressions carefully, reading the story they told about the horses and men who had made them. Cain had reinforced his pursuit team and was now moving to intercept them before they could reach the relative safety of Deadwood. The tracks suggested that the outlaws knew exactly where Jack was headed and were positioning themselves to control the approaches to the town. What had begun as a straightforward chase had evolved into a carefully orchestrated trap. Jack made a difficult decision. The main trail to Deadwood was clearly compromised, but there was an alternate route through the mountains. That would add 2 days to their journey while avoiding the most obvious ambush points. The mountain trail was dangerous, particularly for a loaded wagon, but it offered their best chance of reaching safety without confronting Cain's full strength. They turned west toward the distant peaks, leaving the well-traveled road for a narrow track that wound upward through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. The wagon groaned under the strain of the steep grades, and Jack was forced to walk alongside the team to reduce the load on the struggling animals. Catherine walked beside him, her city shoes poorly suited for the rough terrain but her determination unwavering. The mountain air was thin and cold, a sharp contrast to the desert heat they had left behind. Snow capped the higher peaks, and Jack knew that unseasonable weather could trap them in places where rescue would be impossible. But the mountains also offered concealment and defensive positions that could offset Kane's numerical advantage if another confrontation became unavoidable. As they climbed higher, Catherine began to share more details about what she had witnessed in the Silver Dollar Saloon. Judge McKinnon had not been a random victim, but a specific target chosen, because of his pending decision in a case that could have sent Kane to the gallows. The evidence planted on his body was designed to discredit testimony he had planned to give in federal court, testimony that would have exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. Jack realized that Catherine's knowledge made her far more dangerous to Kane than he had initially understood. She was not merely a witness to murder, but a threat to an entire criminal organization with connections throughout the law enforcement and political establishment. The scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered meant that even reaching Deadwood might not guarantee her safety. The mountain trail tested every skill Jack had acquired during 12 years of traversing hostile territory. Sections of the path had been washed out by spring floods, forcing him to find alternate routes that skirted dangerous precipices and unstable rock formations. The wagon wheels slipped on loose stones, and more than once only Jack's quick reflexes prevented a disaster that would have sent them tumbling down 1,000-foot cliffs. Catherine proved to be remarkably resilient, adapting to the harsh conditions without complaint and contributing wherever her limited wilderness experience allowed. She gathered firewood, helped tend the horses, and maintained a positive attitude that bolstered Jack's determination to see her safely to their destination. Her courage in the face of overwhelming odds reminded him of why he had chosen to help her despite the obvious risks to his own survival. On the second day in the mountains, they encountered their most serious obstacle yet. The trail ahead was blocked by a massive rock slide that had occurred sometime during the previous winter, creating a barrier that extended for several hundred yards along a narrow ridge. Going around would require descending into a valley controlled by Kane's men, while attempting to clear a path through the debris would take days they did not have. Jack studied the rock slide carefully, analyzing the stability of the remaining slope and calculating the risks of attempting to move the blocking stones. The work would be dangerous and exhausting, but it appeared to be their only viable option. He began the painstaking process of shifting rocks, moving the smaller stones first to create access to the larger obstacles that truly blocked their passage. Catherine worked beside him despite his protests, her delicate hand soon bloodied by the sharp edges of broken stone. Together they labored through the afternoon, gradually opening a narrow corridor through the debris field. The work was backbreaking, and both of them were exhausted by the time a passable route emerged. As they prepared to guide the wagon through their improvised path, the sound of distant gunfire echoed up from the valley below. Jack counted at least 20 shots fired in rapid succession, followed by the unmistakable sound of men shouting orders and horses moving at speed. Kane's forces were engaged in some kind of action, possibly with local law enforcement or rival outlaws, but the distraction provided an unexpected opportunity. They pushed through the rock slide passage as quickly as safety allowed, the wagon wheels slipping on loose stones while the nervous horses struggled to maintain their footing on the unstable surface. Twice the vehicle nearly overturned, and only Jack's strength and Catherine's quick thinking prevented disasters that would have stranded them in the mountains without transportation or supplies. Once through the obstacle, they found themselves on a downward slope that offered their first clear view of Deadwood in the distance. The town spread across a valley floor like a collection of children's toys, its buildings and streets laid out in the orderly pattern that distinguished established settlements from the chaotic camps that sprang up around mining strikes and railroad construction projects. But between their current position and the safety of Deadwood, Jack could see dust clouds that indicated the movement of large groups of riders. Kane's forces were repositioning themselves, probably in response to whatever conflict had generated the gunfire they had heard earlier. The final approach to town would require careful timing and possibly one last desperate run through hostile territory. They descended from the mountains as the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that reflected off the snow-covered peaks behind them. The beauty of the scene was marred by the knowledge that somewhere in the gathering darkness, dangerous men were preparing for what would likely be the final confrontation in this deadly game of cat and mouse. As full darkness settled over the landscape, Jack made his decision. They would approach Deadwood under cover of night, using the confusion and limited visibility to slip past Kane's watchers and reach the safety of the town's main street. It was a risky strategy, but their alternatives had been exhausted during the long flight from Arizona territory. The wagon rolled quietly through the darkness, its wheels muffled by dust and dried grass as Jack guided his team along barely visible trails that skirted the most obvious approach routes. Catherine sat beside him, her hand resting on the rifle they had positioned within easy reach. Neither of them spoke during the tense journey, both understanding that their survival might depend on maintaining absolute silence. The lights of Deadwood grew steadily brighter as they approached the town's outskirts. Jack could make out individual buildings now, including the sheriff's office where he hoped to find allies who could help protect Catherine from Kane's remaining forces. The end of their desperate flight was finally within reach, but Jack knew from hard experience that the most dangerous moments often came when safety seemed assured. They had covered perhaps half the remaining distance when the trap closed around them. Riders emerged from concealment on both sides of the trail, their weapons already drawn and aimed at the wagon. In the pale moonlight, Jack could see at least 10 men, all of them professionals who had positioned themselves with the skill of experienced killers. At their head rode Silas Kane himself, his pale eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction as he surveyed his captured prey. "End of the trail, Morrison," Kane's voice carried easily across the short distance separating them. "You've led us quite a chase, but every hunt ends the same way. The predator gets his prey." Jack's hand moved slowly toward his rifle, but Kane's sharp laugh stopped him before he could complete the motion. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action. My men have you covered from 6 different angles, and Miss Catherine there would be caught in the crossfire. Surely her life is worth more to you than a futile gesture of defiance." Catherine felt the weight of all those watching eyes and understood that her moment of decision had finally arrived. Throughout their flight from Arizona territory, she had been a passenger in her own fate, depending on Jack's skills and determination to carry her to safety. Now the time had come for her to make a choice that would determine not only her own survival, but that of the man who had risked everything to help her. "What do you want, Kane?" Jack's voice was steady despite their hopeless situation. Kane's smile was cold and calculating. "I want the girl, naturally. She witnessed something that could prove inconvenient to my business interests. But I also want you to understand the consequences of interfering in matters that don't concern you. Your reputation as an unstoppable bounty hunter ends here, in this valley, with your death serving as an example to others who might consider similar heroics." The standoff stretched for long moments, neither side willing to make the first move that would trigger a gunfight, whose outcome was predetermined by superior numbers and positioning. Jack calculated angles and distances, searching for any tactical advantage that might give them a chance of survival. But Kane's men had chosen their ground well, and escape seemed impossible. It was Catherine who broke the deadlock with a decision that surprised everyone present. "I'll come with you, Kane," she said, her voice clear and strong in the desert night. "But you let Jack right away. He's done nothing except help someone in need, and killing him won't serve any purpose except satisfying your ego." Kane considered her offer with the calculating expression of a man who always sought maximum advantage from every situation. Jack Morrison's death would indeed send a message to other potential interferers, but the bounty hunter's survival might serve an even more useful purpose. A living legend who had been forced to back down would be more damaging to the mystique of frontier justice than a dead hero who could be martyred and remembered. "An interesting proposal," Kane mused. But what guarantee do I have that Morrison won't simply resume his interference the moment I release him? Catherine's response demonstrated a courage and intelligence that impressed even Kane's hardened followers. Because he's a professional, and professionals understand when they've been beaten. Jack Morrison will ride away because he knows that trying to rescue me would only get us both killed without accomplishing anything useful. The cold logic of her argument was undeniable. But Jack found himself struggling against every instinct that had sustained him through 12 years of hunting killers. Abandoning Catherine to Kane's mercy violated every principle that had driven him to help her in the first place. Yet he also recognized the wisdom in her sacrifice, the practical reality that their situation offered no honorable alternatives. Kane made his decision with the swift calculation of a man accustomed to command. Very well. Morrison rides away and the girl comes with me. But understand this, bounty hunter, if I see you again, if you make any attempt to follow us or interfere with my business, both you and the girl will pay the price for your heroics. The exchange was completed with the efficiency of a business transaction. Catherine climbed down from the wagon and walked steadily toward Kane's position, her head held high despite the fear that must have been coursing through her veins. Jack watched her go with a mixture of admiration and anguish, knowing that her sacrifice was saving his life while condemning her to an uncertain fate. Kane's riders formed a protective circle around Catherine as they prepared to depart, but their leader had one final message for the bounty hunter who had caused him so much trouble. There's a price on your head now, Morrison. $5,000 for the man who brought down Jack Morrison, the legendary bounty hunter who finally met his match. Every gun in the territory will be looking for you, and they'll all want to be the one who claims that reward. The words hit Jack like physical blows, confirming his worst fears about the consequences of his decision to help Catherine. By morning, every ambitious killer, desperate outlaw, and professional gunfighter would know that Jack Morrison was worth more dead than most men were worth alive. His reputation, carefully built over 12 years of successful hunts, had become a target painted on his back. Kane's group disappeared into the darkness, taking Catherine with them and leaving Jack alone beside his wagon in the empty valley. The silence that followed their departure was profound and devastating, broken only by the nervous movement of his horses and the distant sound of coyotes calling across the moonlit landscape. For the first time since he had found Catherine hiding in the Silver Dollar Saloon, Jack Morrison was forced to confront the full scope of what his act of mercy had cost him. His profession, his reputation, and his future had all been sacrificed for a woman he barely knew, a woman who was now beyond his ability to help or protect. But as he sat in the darkness, reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this moment, Jack realized that he regretted nothing. Catherine had been worth saving, worth fighting for, worth the destruction of everything he had built during his years as a bounty hunter. Some principles were more important than personal survival, and some fights were worth fighting even when victory was impossible. The bounty on his head would bring every killer in the territory searching for him. But Jack Morrison had faced overwhelming odds before and emerged victorious. He was still alive, still armed, and still capable of making his enemies pay a heavy price for their pursuit. The hunt that Silas Kane had initiated would not end the way the outlaw leader expected. As dawn broke over the valley, Jack Morrison began planning his next move in what had become the most important hunt of his career, the hunt for Catherine's freedom and Kane's destruction. The legendary bounty hunter had become the hunted, but the game was far from over.